Daftaboutcraft, the craft beer podcast.
Thank you for taking the time to download this episode of Daftaboutcraft. It is a special episode featuring a chat with the legendary Matthias of Schlenkerla in Germany. You can catch the next full episode of Daftaboutcraft, episode number 41, from Monday the 6th of March, when amongst all our usual features, we'll also be speaking to Logan from Sinister Brewery in Scotland.
We often have special guests. This time it's a special guest that I'm especially excited about. Regular listeners know that I do enjoy Rauchbiers and smoked beers a lot. And when you are discussing such beers, there is really only one place to start, and that is Schlenkerla in Bamberg in Germany. And I'm delighted to say we are joined by brewmaster and owner Matthias. Matthias, thank you ever so much for joining us all the way from Bamberg.
Thank you very much for having me, Dave. I'm really delighted to be here tonight, and I hope I can tell a little bit to your listeners about Schlenkerla and Rauchbier. I understand this is difficult to pronounce for everybody if you're coming from an English tongue, but we can talk a little bit more about that later. And don't be put off when you had enough of Schlenkerla. You can pronounce pretty much every German word.
Well, like Dave says, he's incredibly excited because German beers are his thing. He's the expert on this.
No pressure for me.
That's right.
Yes, as Dave says, German beers are sort of how I first got into beer and then by extension craft beer. For yourself, it's just been a family thing which has now run for centuries, hasn't it? I mean, this is the thing. We talk to a lot of breweries who've been going maybe 2, 3, 4 years, but just for people who maybe aren't familiar, how long has Schlenkerla been in existence?
I run Schlenkerla in the 6th family generation. So my family line goes back 150 years or so, but Schlenkerla is much older than that. The first records we have are from the year 1405. At the time, the building was called the House of the Blue Lion, and shortly thereafter, it was the Brewery of the Blue Lion. So there's more than 500 years of history in there. There were some interruptions, like the 30-year War, when the beer production went down. Probably Bamberg population went down considerably during that time. But it is a pretty continuous history all over those centuries, and it's all about traditional beer brewing and the traditional way of making malt, which we still do ourselves. And as you've pointed out, I grew up here in the brewery. Actually, I'm sitting now in the first floor above the brewery pub, which used to be my children's room, and nowadays is my office. So I never really switched a lot around, apart from going to university in Weinstefan for a couple of years. But apart from that, it's always been about continuing the tradition and living here in Bamberg and in the brewing history. So raised by the bottle and continue to fill it these days, basically.
So this may sound like a silly question, but what has changed in 500 years?
At Schlenkerla or in general?
Well, I mean, in general, quite a few things, but in terms of you guys?
At Schlenkerla, we have an electric cashier these days, computer-based system. We have a website, which obviously we didn't have 500 years ago. Cooking is done electrically in the kitchen. There's, of course, certain modern elements in the brewing production, like there's combustion-driven truck rather than a horse carriage driving the beer around. Also, everything which is hard labor for the people, like lifting crates and stuff like that. For that, you have machinery like a forklift and this. The basic principle of the brewing, no, hasn't changed. It's pretty much the same as back then. The basic that happens with the grain, the kilning, the brewing of the beer. There's, of course, an automated stirring system in the mashing tun, like not a guy standing there with a paddle moving it around like that. But what's happening in the beer, in the product, in the mash, that's still the same. So we're basically emulating, I guess that would be the modern term. We're emulating what has been done manually in the old days with certain additions, because simply labor these days, certain works people won't do anymore. For instance, turning the grain in the smoke kiln, which was done manually in the old days, that wouldn't be allowed today for labor safety, obviously. So certain things have changed in that respect, but the basic principle is all the same.
Obviously, there's quality control, but with the generations and that, has modern technology made things any better or not?
Well, the current brew house, the copper brew house, was built by my great-grandfather in the 1930s. And this is essentially the same technology used. It's computerized these days to make certain things more efficient. Like in the old days, my father told me there was always a night shift of the brewers. And usually, you're talking about quality, there was certain issues with the night shift. People, not being as concentrated as during the day. So the original gravity might have been slightly off from the night shift and stuff like that. So here the computer really helps to get a more homogenic and even quality. And I think the biggest change that has happened in the past 200, 300 years, which came to brewing on a positive side, is hygiene. It was always very important for brewers to work cleanly, to work very cleanly. When you look into old brewing books from the 17th or 18th century, this is always pointed out that brewers need to work in a clean fashion and clean manner, because otherwise the beer will spoil or turn sour or have any other forms of defect. But this has been taken to a total new level in modern times with Louis Pasteur, who discovered the microorganisms and what to do about them. So the materials we're using today are much better. The stainless steel lagering vessels obviously produce a longer shelf life of the beer than the original iron ones would have done or the wooden ones would have done. And all the detergents we're having available to clean our tools, to clean the copper brewing vessel inside. So we can produce beer at a much lower risk, or basically almost no risk of infection, and therefore can have a very stable flavor, even relatively long time after the filling. And the entire process of bottling is something relatively new. Here in Bamberg, we still have that old tradition called the Gassenschenke, which means pouring to the street, basically. So in the times before bottling in supermarkets were invented, people would come with big pitchers or mugs to the breweries, pick up the beer there and take it home with them. And that still happens today, though most of the people now just stand in front of the Schlenkerla and drink it there because it's just a nice happening place. So this old tradition is continued, and the bottling, of course, made it possible to transport beer over longer distances and have it in a more stable quality. In that respect, I think the modern times have brought a lot to improve the beer quality, and also to improve the range on which you can distribute your beer, which for a specialty like Schlenkerla is, of course, a huge advantage.
And you say there at the end, the speciality. Now, the Rauchbier isn't that common over here, but in Germany it's bigger. But obviously there's yourself and Spezial in Bamberg. There's two brewers that do it. First of all, this isn't a style everyone will have had. If you could just explain that a bit. And also your method of malting, which is what sets Schlenkerla apart. So it's going to be a long answer, I appreciate, but there's a lot to do there. But if you could just sort of take us through what makes a Schlenkerla beer so different.
It's two questions you put at first.
Sure.
So smoke beer, Rauchbier is outside Bamberg or internationally a specialty, and you don't find it a lot of places. Our importer is James Clay in the UK, and then they sell in many places, but it's obviously not a beer you find at the supermarket around the corner or something you have to look for. And the same, and that might be a surprise for you, actually is true for Germany. When people look from the outside to Germany, they think, oh, it's this huge beer country and lager beers and, all these stereotypes, purity law and so forth. What most people don't realize, this is actually just Bavaria, mainly. So Germany used to be separated into many different countries. I'm not talking East and West Germany during the Cold War. I'm talking 200, 300 years ago, when Germany was comprised of dozens or hundreds of territories, and some more bigger like Prussia and Bavaria, and many others very small. And because of that, we still have a very diverse history within Germany. And when you're talking about German beer, you would actually have to look at different beer styles from different areas. So, for instance, in Cologne and Düsseldorf, they would have ales very similar to British ales, not in flavor, but in production, like high temperature fermentation, short production. And the typical lager style beers, which Germany is now known from, are a more or less Bavarian or actually more a Franconian thing. Bavaria was very big for wheat beers and still is. And the lager beers there only became popular 120 or something like that years ago. And the typical lager beer region here is Franconia, which is also connected to Bohemia. So we can drive here from Bamberg in like 2 hours to the city of Prague. So that's technically closer to us than, say, Berlin or Hamburg. Yeah, so there's a lot of cultural similarities there. So to round up that long story, smoked beer is something which is very special for Bamberg and Franconia. But even when you go to the rest of Bavaria, southern Bavaria, or anywhere else in Germany, you still have to go to a specialty store to find it. You won't find it in a normal supermarket. It's a very special thing here in the area. Now, why is that? The true background story of smoked beer is, if you want to do it the original, the traditional way, is that you have to look at the malting process. In the malting process, I guess your listeners know the basic principles of beer, so I won't start with Adam and Eve here. But in the malting process, at the end of the malting process, it is necessary to dry the green malt, to dry the most moist malt, in order to make it storable. Now, in modern malt houses, that happens with hot air, which is generated by modern heating systems, gas-driven, oil-driven, sometimes even electricity. The common ground for that is that the similarities is that this air is basically aroma free. There's no smoke inside or any residue from the heating system. Traditionally, this technology was not available. Traditionally, malt was dried in two different ways. There was so-called air-dried malt, which basically was left out in the sun to be dried there, similar to when the farmers in the summertime do their harvest and let the grass lay on the field for a while in order to dry it out. So that was the very first method of how in Mesopotamia, when beer was invented, the grain was dried. Here in Central Europe, that technology would not have been possible, or that technique would not have been possible in the wintertime because it was too moist. So the only other way of drying malt was to dry it over an open fire. When you dry malt over an open fire in the traditional way, in the old times, it was unavoidable that the smoke from the fire penetrated the malt and gave the malt a smoky aroma and flavor. So then you have a smoky malt, a smoked malt. And when you make a beer from that malt, it will have a smoked aroma and flavor. And what we perceive today as the standard beer flavor without smoke, that was actually a relatively new invention done in England in the 17th century. England was basically independent on energy imports from the Baltics, from the Russian territory. And that was something the English king didn't want to have. So this new invention, which made it possible to switch from high-grade quality wood to any type of fuel, was a huge advantage for the British economy to not be dependent on those imports. So this invention made it possible to use any type of fuel. It was lower in fire hazard and fire risk for the brewery. And also it was possible to build the kiln on a larger scale, meaning to mass produce the malt. So very quickly, new malting factories were founded. The patent was, it developed new patents, or additional patents were issued for even better technologies. And within like 100 years or so, the majority of the breweries had closed down their smoke malt operations and had switched to the modern type malts, which were smoke-free. I think that also fashion played a certain role. When you look today, a lot of people have difficulties with the smoke flavor in beer because it's just so dominant and not everybody likes smoke flavors. And now there were beers available without a smoky flavor, which probably were the more fashionable option. So relatively quickly, the smoked beer and the smoked malt got extinct. Around 1800, the industrialization came to the continent, and with it, the technology of English malt making. And one of the first breweries in Germany was the Spaten brewery of Munich. Spaten still exists today. Georg Sedelmeier, the owner, he was one of the first ones to close down his Bavarian kiln, meaning his smoke kiln, and to replace it with an English kiln, meaning a non-smoke kiln. So even in Germany, That modern type of kilning was called the English kiln because it was so defined from the English beer style. And the same happened here in Germany than in England. Production was cheaper, mass production was easier, fire hazard was lower. So within a century or so, basically all the breweries stopped making smoked malt and stopped making smoked beer. Well, almost all the breweries. Bamberg played a special role in that. Bamberg had, in the 19th century, roughly 70 breweries. By 1800, all of them were doing smoked beer. By 1850, about half of them had closed down their smoke kilns. And around 1900, only 4 of them were left to produce smoked malt or produce malt in the traditional way. One was Schlenkerla. We're still doing it today. The other one was Spezial, which you've mentioned. They also still are doing it today. The third one was the brewery Greifenklau. That brewery also still exists today, but they stopped their malting operation after World War II, so they only have normal beer these days. And the fourth one was the brewery Pollerbier, and they closed down in World War II because their owner, I think, died in the war or something like that. So that brewery doesn't exist anymore. So to make a long story short, Schlenkerla and Spezial are the only 2 breweries in the world which have continued that old style. And therefore, we were named Passengers of the Ark of Taste by the organization Slow Food in 2017. Nowadays, there's more breweries, again, which produce smoked beer. With the craft beer revolution starting in the United States in the 1980s, a lot of attention was put into beer diversity and also to bring back old styles or continue old styles. So my father always tells me that he was contacted by various brewers who wanted to buy our smoked malt to make smoked beer themselves. There even was one time where Americans flew all the way over to try to convince him to sell it. But we neither had the capacity nor the intention to sell our smoked malt because we only do that for our own production. Obviously, where there's a demand, there's going to be a supply eventually. So the big industry maltings found a way to produce smoked malt in a industrial scale. So it's basically a smoke flavored malt. And ever since the 1980s, that's available from commercial malt houses. And so a lot of the craft breweries try and experiment with smoked beers. And here in Franconia, a lot of breweries, because locals simply ask for it because it's a typical beer style here, a lot of local Franconian breweries have restarted smoky beers. I'd say there's like a dozen or 2 dozens of those breweries that do it on and off, not all the time. Many of them try to copy Schlenkerla. We always make a fun of that when we do blind tastings, and it's really easy to tell apart which are the modern ones and which is Schlenkerla, which for most other beers is usually very difficult. You know, when you put big lagers by comparison, a lot of people cannot distinguish that, but with smoked beer it works very easily because the traditional way of doing it is just so different. So the interesting question really is, why did the smoked beer survive in Bamberg, and why wasn't it replaced like elsewhere? I think there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, brewery diversity is just huge here. Franconia has the highest brewery density in the world, so there's 1 brewery per 5,000 residents in a calculated manner. Franconia actually applied to get that listed in the Guinness Book of World Records, but it was declined because Franconia is not a political construct like an independent country. So Guinness Book said those kind of records they won't publish. My personal opinion on that one is, since we know who publishes the Guinness Book of World Record, I think maybe they're not too keen on publishing beer records in there at all. I don't know. So yeah, a huge diversity. And when you have a lot of small breweries, the chances are higher that traditional techniques are continued because big industry breweries obviously cannot and will not do that. There's also a general conservativeness here in Bamberg. Bamberg is a diocese. We have a king bishop still, Catholic in certain ways, maybe a little bit backwards. There is a university with young people, yes. So some things have changed in the last decades or so, but still, I think tradition is very important here. There's also a lot of small bakeries and butcheries. So all those food traditions are kept very dear here. And last but not least, I think there is a big family influence from our end. Around the 1900s, when we had become basically the sole representative together with the other three of smoked beer, my great-grandfather, Michael Graser, he was a very art-oriented person. He's a very fine person, so to say. He wanted to become an art professor, but his father died at a relatively young age, and Michael was the smartest of his brothers and sisters, so he had to continue the business. But he brought a lot of his expertise and knowledge on art and technology and all that into the business. When you come to the Schlenkerla brew pub today, all these old depictions on the walls, the chandeliers, the really nice ones, all that is Michael Graser. And I think he realized that smoked beer is something unique from the past, which needs to be preserved, and that it is on the verge of becoming extinct. And I think he very deliberately made the decision to continue that, to keep the old smoke kiln in operation, to keep the fire burning. Also, from an economic point of view, obviously, he thought that this was something, unique to us, which could not be copied by others. He was also the one who turned the nickname Schlenkerla, we can talk about that later on, into a company name, and he actually got it trademarketed in the 1920s, long before any other small brewers would think of something like a trademark at all. So I think he was really ahead of his time, and we all beer lovers today have to thank Michael to having continued the smoked beer in the traditional way.
Wow, there's a lot to pick apart there, lots of questions to ask. I made a few notes as we were going along. I'm interested in who drinks your beer now in the modern era. Is it young people, old people? Is there a mix?
It's a mix right across the board. I was pointing out the university early on. A lot of students very much love the Bamberg beer culture, not only Schlenkerla smoked beer, but also the other breweries. Bamberg has around 10 breweries with at a size of 70,000 residents. So it's still a huge diversity. All local craft brews. Well, there's one large one, but the other ones are all small craft brews. So drinking local beer is something of a cult or something of a fashionable thing. And I was telling you early on that people nowadays have that old Gassenschenken tradition, and they pick up the beer and they stand in front of Schlenkerla and they enjoy the sun, and they stand there and talk and they watch the people passing by. And that's mainly a thing young people do, the locals. And this is a happening place where people get together. So a lot of young people in there. There's also a lot of regulars, which are a little bit older usually. Most of us who work every day, we cannot be regulars in a tavern. So once you retire, you can afford to go to a tavern every day or a couple of times a week. So there's a lot of those. Not as many as 20, 30 years ago, because behaviors a little bit changed. I think with equal rights of women, men are not allowed so often in the pub anymore when they get older. So maybe that plays a certain role in there. And there's also a lot of visitors from other cities or from other countries coming to Bamberg. Bamberg is UNESCO World Heritage City. We actually have 30-year anniversary this year of being a World Cultural Heritage. Beautiful cathedral. There's 2,000 protected buildings in town, which is like the largest intact old city quarter in all of Germany. So a lot of visitors coming here to see that and to enjoy the beer as they go along. So it's a really, really cool mix. And I remember a couple of years ago when I came, like the Schlenkerla Tavern consists of several rooms, and there's something called the Altes Lokal, the Old Inn. When you come inside and you turn left, the first room, that's where all the old regulars sit in. And it's really hard to find a table in there because usually all the Stammtisches there, as they call it in German, are not too keen on sharing their table. And I come in there and there's this table with the really old guys, and there's suddenly like 3 or 4 blonde young girls sitting with them. And I'm like, hey, what's going on? How did they end up with that? And it turns out it was Swedish hitchhikers or backpack students which were traveling around, and they had The Lonely Planet. And I wasn't aware of that. The Lonely Planet, you might know that tour guide for young people. They always have like the 10 hottest or best tips on a destination or a country on the inside. And I don't know whether that is still today, but at the time, Bamberg was one of the top 10 things to do in Germany because of the beer diversity, to go there and to try the beers. So this is how these blonde Swedish students ended up at the regular table. And I think everybody had plenty of fun that night. And so these are the things that can happen at Schlenkerla. The people get together, a total mix. You have the craft person next to the professor, and you have these long tables where 8 or 10 people can sit together. Marriages were started in there. So it's a very open and diverse thing where people can get together.
Given all of the history of Schlenkerla and the traditional processes, you've mentioned craft beer a few times. What do you personally make of the craft beer scene and craft beer's versions of smoked beers?
The craft beer scene is a great development for the appreciation of beer. I think when we look what happened here in Germany, I don't know about other countries, in the 70s and early 80s, where all the beer went more and more to standardized flavors and mass production, I think that was a horrible development. And craft beer really brought appreciation back for beer, for flavors, for craft production of it, and not the mass production. Obviously, not every beer drinker is going to switch to that, but a lot of beer drinkers moved over to that, and people are more interested into what they're drinking and the background. And I mean, that's very much what Schlenkerla is about. When you drink a smoked beer, at first it's like, whoa, what kind of flavor is that? Oh my God. And a lot of people really have a hard time. There's this old Bamberg proverb that you have to drink 3 pints to fully get into the flavor. Or you need to know the background story of why smoked beer tastes the way it does and where it came from and why it used to be the standard beer and was replaced by what we know today. And once you're open to this kind of story, it will totally change your perception of the flavor. And even if you say, okay, this is not a beer I can drink every day, it's something, hey, that's a taste experience and I know something about that. So I think it's really great that craft beer made that possible, because otherwise these beer specialties like smoked beer would eventually had a really hard time of surviving and still be there. I have a little problem with the craft beer development is what you also see, that some guy or some people who don't know much about brewing at all get together and they have a marketing plan and they have somebody in the back who gives them the money, and then they just go about the most extreme flavor combination just to stick out from the rest without looking to that it actually tastes good. So with that, I have a certain problem, but I think the market is going to solve that somehow, because people won't drink those beers for a long time.
And have you seen, with perhaps more smoked beers coming through in craft beer, has that seen a bit of an uptick in your sales? Because then people are exploring the style and coming back to finding where it all began almost. Because I remember my first experience with Schlenkerla was about 15 years ago, and I had the exact thing of it tasted like a hot dog. I didn't understand it, left it alone for a lot of years, and then came back to it a few years ago, and now I love it, and I'll drink happily a lot of it. And even now I'll still give it to friends and they have that same reaction because they haven't had it before. And it feels now like, because there's so many different beer styles out there, that this is perfectly acceptable. Why wouldn't you try a smoked beer? So has that sort of helped yourselves of getting to a new audience almost?
Definitely. It definitely did. It broadened the mind of people, and people are more ready to try something. But there's also a second aspect to that. The whole logistics and sales infrastructure became much better for beers like Schlenkerla. 20 or 25 years ago, when you tried to sell a specialty beer in Germany outside Bamberg, you would have had a hard time getting logistics for that, because all the wholesalers only thought in pallets and standardized beers. There wasn't even any special beer store. And obviously you cannot put something like Schlenkerla in the shelf of the common supermarket. It won't be sold in enough amount. So that really helps. Though on the other hand, I think we're seeing in Germany the same that has happened in the United States and probably also in Great Britain. It seems that the peak of that development has been reached and gone over a little bit. So yes, diversity is still there. Yes, there's still a lot of beer specialty stores and all that. But I think the biggest hype is over. So we're going to get into a new form of equilibrium there. So we're not at peak sales anymore. Of course, Corona had a certain impact on that as well. And now with the whole export situation, like shipping problems and the war, of course, we had an importer in Russia, which we don't supply anymore now, obviously, for obvious reasons. We have an importer in Ukraine. They still actually get beer, which is surprising to me, but of course at lower amounts. So yeah, there's certain impacts on that, and the whole globalization or deglobalization, I think we can almost call it by now. I mean, England leaving the UK, the European Union, that also was no help for trade with all the additional papers that have to be filled out now and so forth. So I think the big hype for craft beer for now is over, but it's not going to go away. It's just going to go on some new level, basically, where it's still out there.
You touched on a few things there I was going to mention as well with the war in Russia. Now, I was going to go on to ask about how you've been affected by rising costs, and have your costs risen over there? Because here, our gas, our electricity, our malt, everything is more and more expensive. Is that the same for you guys?
It definitely is. The prices for barley, like we buy barley, not malt. The prices for barley have been going up actually the last 2-3 years already. The big influence here is climate change. Germany doesn't have enough rain, so our harvests are too low. So barley needs to be imported. And yes, Ukraine is one of the big sellers, obviously. So the war made things worse. So at the moment, we're paying about double the price for barley than we used to. A big issue is energy, obviously. Our brew house runs on gas. The steam producer runs on gas. So that has become extremely expensive in the last year. It's now coming a little bit back, but I think the new level is going to be about two to three times the price we used to have. Electricity for the same reason, because that's somehow bound with the gas-driven power plants. The special problem we have at Schlenkerla is that we are a protected monument, so we're not allowed to put solar panels on the roofs. So we don't really have any means of getting around there. Water prices are still stable, at least here in Bamberg, because that's a communal thing. I don't know how long that's going to be. The biggest problem is actually bottles. Germany has a very effective returnable system. When I sell it within Germany or within the Bamberg region, I use a bottle 30 to 40 times. So bottle cost is not that big of an issue for that. But bottle costs have almost doubled as well. They're even hard to come by because a large part of the German glassware came from Ukraine and Russia, which at the moment obviously doesn't work. And at the same time, the German producers run on gas, which makes it expensive, and they don't have enough capacity. So there's actually a shortage of glass in Germany, mainly white glass, so that doesn't affect the breweries that much. But yeah, the price has doubled. And for export, that's of course a problem insofar as the bottle won't come back. So that price has to be added on top of the case price. So that has brought up prices considerably. And crown caps, labels, the carton boxes, all that went up as well. And now I think the wages are going to follow because all the unions, of course, calling for higher wages because people have to pay more for their daily living. So the question is it going to be like in the 70s where we have a spiral of increasing prices and high inflation for the next 10 years? Or whether that is a one-time thing and eventually we're returning back to normal development. And yeah, all that is not in our hands. It's basically decided in Moscow, which is really frustrating.
Obviously, that's not the nicest of topics to discuss, but what we should discuss as well while we're here, we'd be remiss not to, is the Rauchbier, the Urbock. If you taste it and you've never had it, it's a very different experience. And like I say, I first tasted it and thought it tasted like hot dog. Other people say bacon. What should people who haven't had one before or sort of thinking, well, we're talking about this smoked beer. What on earth does it all taste like? What do you get out of one?
Well, for me, since I'm used to the smoke flavor, the smokiness is actually not so dominant in the foreground. And when we're talking the Urbock, which is like the big brother of the classic Märzen smoked beer. It's this extreme malt-rich flavor, very balanced, almost close to what you know from these Trappist beers, which are really complex in maltiness and aromas. And the smokiness is, for me, only in the background of that, like the underground noise of the entire flavor. And then you have these really smooth hoppiness that combines it. I love the Urbock mostly, or the best time to drink the Urbock is at our annual Urbock tapping. There it comes from the wooden barrel. It's unfiltered. It has been matured for 6 months in the rock cellars. And that's just an awesome flavor explosion in your mouth. For those of your listeners who maybe not had a smoked beer before, or maybe tonight have their first ones when they're listening, when you drink your very first smoked beer, your perception is going to be different from what I've just described. Your very first smoked beer is, or your very first Schlenkerla, we have to say, it doesn't account for all the smoked beers. Your very first Schlenkerla is going to be an explosion of smokiness in your mouth. So at your first sip, you basically have only smokiness. A lot of people compare that to sausage or ham or flavors like that, or a barbecue. What basically happens is you have to look how our mouth, or how we perceive flavors. In our mouth, we can only perceive 5 types of flavors. It's sweet, sour, salty, umami, and bitter. Umami is that rich flavor. It was discovered by someone in Japan. But only those 5 flavors we perceive with our taste buds in the mouth. All the other flavor elements we perceive with our nose. So what basically happens is when you drink a Schlenkerla, the smoke from the liquid becomes airborne through the warmth of your mouth. And that smoke aroma, chemically, it's a water-fluent phenol. That's from a chemical point of view, and it's actually measurable in the beer. So that smokiness then gets into your nose, and you perceive it like when you walk into a house where you have an open fire burning. Maybe from an evolutionary background or historic background, smoke is always something which, gets us alert. Oh, smoke, there's fire. I have to be careful, run away. Maybe that's our old animal instincts. And so smoke is something really extremely dominant, and everything else goes in the background and is at first blended out. But when you had a couple of sips, the same happens when you smell smoke. When you come to a room and you smell smoke, or you smell anything in there, very quickly that smell fades away and you adapt yourself to that new environment. That happens when you drink it. So after a couple of sips, the smokiness becomes less dominant, and then the secondary flavors can come through: the maltiness, the hoppiness, the richness. So in effect, when you follow that old proverb, that old tradition, you have to drink 3 pints to fully acquire the flavor. The first 3 pints of Schlenkerla are going to be 3 different beers for you. The first one is only smoky. The second one is a mixture between smoky and malty. And the third one, then you're in the final flavor, as I perceive it, or as experienced Schlenkerla drinkers perceive it. Then you have the actual beer flavor as it is, without the smoke overpowering it. If you then still don't like it, too bad. I sold 3 beers. But
that's a good sales technique.
A lot of people will go will get to the flavor and then can really enjoy it.
And of course, if they don't like that one, while we were talking earlier, I drank the Hells, which I also liked. But what I didn't realise until I was researching before we met is that doesn't actually have any smoked malt in it, I believe. Yet you still get a smoky smell and taste. So why is that the case? How do you manage to get smoke into a beer with no smoke?
Well, basically, it's a contamination in production process. Like we cannot do it anywhere else. It's like when you walk through a smoky room and after that your clothes are smelling like smoky. Mm-hmm. What happens is, in the brewing process, we reuse the yeast. So at the end of fermentation, the main batch of the yeast is harvested, it's cleansed, and then reused for the next batch. And as the lager is only a small proportion of what we do, like 70-80% of what we produce is a classic smoke beer. And the lager is only a side addition to that. So the lager is always running through the same kettles and the same system. The malt for the lager beer runs through the same malt mill, so there's a certain residue of smokiness in there. But the main influence is the yeast. The yeast which ferments the lager beer had fermented classic smoke beer before. and the yeast basically carries over the smoke between the batches. We could technically, if we were to purchase new yeast and use that on the lager beer, we could produce it without a smoke flavor, but that wouldn't be no fun. Yeah?
You'd never do
the
that,
lager is a
surely.
Schlenkerla beer, and it has a Schlenkerla connection. And there's a family story to the lager beer, actually. Helles Lager is like the most fashionable beer at the moment in Germany. It's a big hype. Every brewery tries to make one. They all have these blue kind of labels like our Schlenkerla Lager has. That's a development of the last 3 or 4 years, I would say. And all the big breweries have one. Again, Michael Graser, my great-grandfather, sticks out. He made his lager, the lager we still have today, in the 1920s. So 100 years ago, he introduced that. The background story was that after World War I, Germany had the hyperinflation and a crashing economy. So it was a really hard time to survive for businesses. In fact, I think a third of the Bamberg breweries closed down in that time. And my grandfather managed to get a supply contract with the train station of Bamberg for the cantina there. And the German Reichsbahn, the national train system, they said, yeah, we take the smoke beer because it's a local thing, but we also want a standard lager beer, which does not have a smoky flavor. So my grandfather said, yeah, no problem. My great-grandfather, and he made that Schlenkerla Lager, the Helles Lager. And it's become, ever since then, something of like a secret tip for the local craftsmen. It's a little bit lower in alcohol, 4.3%. And you could see it a lot, those crates on construction sites where people would drink it there. Very standardized label, nothing fancy. The smokiness was only on the side. So the locals here in Bamberg, they don't perceive the lager as a smoke beer. They say for them that's a normal lager beer because they're used to smoky flavors from the classic Schlenkerla. But I agree. Everywhere else, when you have it, especially if you had a normal lager before, you definitely taste the smoky flavor in that. But technically, it's not a smoke beer. Our importer in the United States sometimes calls it the homeopathic smoke beer because the smoke is carried over and the water remembers, so to say.
You go either way again on the strength of your beers because they're not the only 2 beers in your range. There's a Doppelbock, which I have had, and there's also, is it Hansler? That's like 0.9%. So you do cater for a lot of strengths.
When I took over from my father, there was the classic Märzen, there was the Urbock, there was the lager, and there was a smoked wheat beer. That was it. Of course, the most important thing is to carry on with the tradition and to uphold the old recipes. But obviously, being a young person, you want to do certain things maybe differently or contribute in some way. And since history was always my favorite topic in school, and I also majored in history on brewing science in Weinstefan, and Schlenkerla is all about historic beer production, and smoke beer is all about history. The route was clear. During my research in Weinstefan, I found a lot of background information on how smoke beer was done in the old days and what was available or what was done, which actually we hadn't been doing for centuries. So the classic Märzen smoke beer is made with a malt dried over beechwood. But obviously in the past, other types of woods were used as well. So oak was used, for instance. Same in England, by the way. I found records that smoke malt was done with oak smoke or with oak fire in the UK. And so we made an experiment, one batch of barley malt, which we dried over oak fire. And I first expected the malt to be darker and the smoke flavor to be more intense than the barley. Than for the beech, but it actually was the other way around. The color was a little bit lighter, and the smoke was much smoother. It was not so harsh, not so biting. So we said, or I said, let's turn that into a mellow Doppelbock, where the sweetness from the Bock beer complements that smooth smokiness. So that's the Schlenkerla Oak Smoke, the Doppelbock you were talking about. So we introduced that in 2008, I think, 2008 or 9. One of my favorite beers from our brewery, and we just won a gold medal last year at the European Beer Star for that as the best strong smoked beer, and it's just a huge explosion of flavor in your mouth. So that was one of the editions. I did a number of other editions, and in the last couple of years, it became more and more people asked about beer with little or no alcohol in the brewery pub. You know, the designated driver or people wanting to tour the city afterwards. And even myself, when I had appointments in the afternoons with journalists or with importers, and then you drink 3 or 4 regular Schlenkerlas, and then in the evening you have to work in the tavern. That doesn't go that well. I mean, at a young age you can all handle that, but when you get older, it's not that fun anymore. So I remembered that I read on an old brewing technique used here in Bamberg. You might know that in the old days, water was always potentially polluted with bacteria, but like there was no sewage system, there was no water purification. I think London was the first town after the antique times in the 1850s or something, 1860s, when they started to build a new sewage system. So water quality was a big issue, and most people drank beer for that reason. And the problem is when you drink regular beer, you're drunk all day and you cannot go about your work. So a lot of beers were aimed at that daily usage scenario and had lower alcohol. In monasteries, they called that Covent, for instance. I think in England, the porter beers for the porter workers in the harbors were something similar, something like 2% alcohol or in that range. Here in Bamberg, there was a specialty again. Yeah, so the beer diversity here just was bigger. Basically, they had developed a different form of lautering technique, and the standard beer in Bamberg was known to be relatively high in alcohol. They called it was very wine spirited. That was the term at the time, because alcohol and distillation and how to measure that all was not invented yet. So a beer which made you jolly and happy was wine spirited. And the Bamberg beers were stronger than elsewhere. I have old recipe books from my great-great-grandfather from the 1840s. He wrote down all the batches he did from 1840 to 1855 with the malt bill, the yeast use, the hops used, the fermentation temperature, etc., and how much beer it yielded. And it was really fun to see when I analyzed that, or it was strange to see that basically these were all bock beers he was brewing. There was no regular beer. And it didn't make sense. I thought people wouldn't drink bock beer all the time. And when I researched further and looked into old history books, I found that Bamberg brewers actually had 2 products. One product was beer, and the other product was Heinzlein, or Hansler, as you called it. So basically, out of one batch of beer, they would make 2 beers, a strong one and a low alcohol one. And they had a special lautering technique for that, and they had a special mashing technique for that, which I don't want to tell too many details publicly about that. But using the records from my ancestors and also the old brewing books, we were able to replicate that production technology or technique. And I think we made the first batch in 2018, 2019. And when we had it analyzed, we were totally astonished that the alcohol was only 0.9. We had expected something like around 2%, like a light beer, but no, it's 0.9. And it still has a relatively normal beer flavor. Obviously, it doesn't taste like a bock beer. It has a much lighter flavor, but it's nothing comparable to the alcohol-free beers we know today. Like the alcohol-free beers usually are either pasteurized to stop the fermentation, and then they're usually very sweet and not very much beer-like, or they're used with some form of distillation or filtration technology, which takes the alcohol out after the actual production, and that has all kinds of other negative effects on the taste. So while being drinkable, like I don't want to say anything about alcohol-free beer, but it doesn't have a typical beer character usually. And for Heinzlein or for Hansler, that is different. You're really close to the typical beer flavor, very hoppy, very, very rich in flavor, and still only those 0.9% alcohol. And so we introduced the Hansler, the Schlenkerla Hansler, so the low alcohol smoked beer for our brewery pub. And there was a lot of demand for it. A lot of people were asking for it. We instantaneously sold like 100 crates a month just in the tavern of that. And so we made another step, and that's something you might not be aware of. I said this technique is too great to just use it for smoked beer, because obviously in the old days, in the 1800s, already half of the Bamberg breweries had switched from smoked beer to regular beer. So the Heinzlein was also available in a non-smoky version. So I said, well, there's a demand for that. Let's try and do something outside the Schlenkerla range. So in 2020, when Corona hit, we hit the market with the Heinz line in the original form, in the as it was done in the 19th century, in a pale and in a dark version, but without smoke flavor. And it was really well received. It's in every supermarket available in Bamberg. It's a real common local product in only 2 years. And we're preparing to start the export with that. So in the course of this year, probably in the second half, we hope to bring that to other markets as well. I call it my office beer. During the day, it's just great. You don't feel anything from the alcohol. You have a good beer flavor. You have the historic background, which for me is always important. You don't mutilate the beer by pasteurization or filtration or whatever. And you just have that pure old flavor. So that's the second part. It's not a Schlenkerla product because it's not smoky. It's a Heinz line product. But it also breathes a lot of the family history because the recipe book of my ancestors lives in there, basically. 1/3 of the production of Bamberg breweries in the 19th century was Heinz line. So it was really a large amount of beer which was drank like that. And it vanished around 1900 for some reason. I don't know why.
Now, we always ask people we talk to, where do you see yourself in the next 5-10 years? But my question for you is, do you think this will all still be happening in another 500 years' time with your brewery?
500 years is a long time. I certainly hope so. And I will do everything possible to make sure that I can pass on the stick to the next generation. My son is 11. My daughter is 8. My son is already very interested in the business, and it's like, a tavern. He wants to go there every night and help along. So the first steps are made. Obviously, you cannot control the next 20 or so generations, but I think the way we live Schlenkerla today and the way we have documented what the history of the Schlenkerla is and what the recipes are and what's special about it, there's a lot of momentum in order to carry it forward for a couple of generations. And as long as nothing happens like beers in general prohibited or something like that, I think we're on a very, very safe track. Simply also because we're not just about the beer, but also the brewery pub, which has this really historic atmosphere. And taverns are something that's always working. People will always go out one way or the other. So I'm quite positive that in 500 years' time, there's still going to be a Schlenkerla. In what way and whether my family, I don't know. We will see. Well, we won't see, but somebody will.
You mentioned there rediscovered the Hansler beer style going through great grandfather's records and everything, and it sounded like he brewed a lot of bocks. Are there going to be any other beers you are sort of perhaps thinking in months or years to come of other ones you'd like to introduce to the Schlenkerla range?
Not to the Schlenkerla range, because I think we're going to bring 2 more beers to the Schlenkerla range this year.
Okay.
That's something we're preparing at the moment, but it's a little bit too early to tell about. But we're definitely going to talk to James Clay to bring it over. The idea is to have that around July 23rd. We named July 23rd the Smoke Beer Preservation Day because on July 23rd, 1635, the patent for the non-smoke kiln was issued. So we always do something special around that date, brewery tours, presentation on the history of smoke beer, unfiltered editions of some of our beers. And this year we want to bring 2 new styles which play on the kilning technology, so be surprised eventually. From that recipe book, I definitely want to do more things outside the smoke beer range, simply because there is so much special things in there which people don't know anymore today about. There were a number of techniques used. I don't want to say too much out publicly yet, as long as the beer is not there, but hops was treated differently than we do today. The malt was used in other ways than we use it today. And the mashing technology was different. So we're at the moment experimenting with various things in that respect, and some produce really interesting flavor components. So we want to do outside the smoke beer range a number of beers from that recipe books, mainly because Schlenkerla covered this smoke beer range already, more or less. And I think to bring these special techniques from the flavor to the people, a lot of people will have an easier time accessing that flavor without the smoke flavor behind it. So I think that it makes sense to bring it back in that style. Plus, in the 1840s when my grandfather, great-great-grandfather, he was not working here at the Schlenkerla brewery at the time. He was actually the patron of the St. Michaelsburg brewery. The St. Michaelsburg brewery is the oldest brewery, or used to be the oldest brewery in town. It dates back to the 11th century, so much older than Schlenkerla, actually. And it was the monastery brewery of the Benedictine monastery of Bamberg. And that monastery was closed down in 1804 during the course of the secularization. And the entire property was given to the city of Bamberg, which again turned it into a foundation. Now, the specialty was that a lot of monasteries were closed down in the secularization, and a lot of breweries were closed down. But Bamberg made it differently because beer was so important here. They leased out the brewery and had it run by commercial brewers. And my great-great-grandfather, Konrad Graser, he rented the brewery for 25 years and used the old brewing kettles there and the old techniques there. I think at the time they already had a non-smoke kiln. So that's the reason why we want to go into that respect, into that line, and to continue on that end as well. And also, of course, to venture a little bit outside. You know, I was pointing out earlier on, when you're young and you want to do certain things, you want to be experimenting a bit. But for me, always the historic background is the important one. So yes, there's going to be more of that. One beer is there already. It's called the Stiftsgartenbier. We don't export that yet, but when you're here in Bamberg, you can find it. I told you about that. The entire complex of the St. Michaelsburg was turned into a foundation. So today it houses the Bamberg Brewery Museum, and they have the big church up there, which you can, well, not at the moment, it's a construction, but usually you can visit it. And they have something like a monastery shop where you can buy all kinds of things that monks used to make. So they have their own wine up there. Like there's wine grapes are grown up there. They sell certain herbs and spices. And now they also wanted to have a beer. So they approached me, asked me, since I have the original recipe from the St. Michael's, like the recipes from my ancestor. So we produce one of the recipes from that book with Bamberg hops, in fact. So for that occasion, we acquired hops, which is grown locally by a small gardener. And yes, it's almost like a bock beer, 5.7% alcohol. Really smooth in the flavor, very, very drinkable. So whenever you're in Bamberg, you can have a try for that. And part of the sales goes to the foundation for charity and like that. So you're even doing something good when you drink it.
So at the start of talking to you, we got to learn how to correctly pronounce Schlenkerla. Now, Schlenkerla itself, there is a translation and it all relates to the logo on the beer. So how does it all come together? What does Schlenkerla mean? And what does the gentleman on the beer, how does he all tie it together?
Well, in German, when you say schlenkern, it means to dangle or to walk not straight like a drunk person would do. And according to legend, my great-great-grandfather, Andreas Graser, the father of Michael, Andreas Graser, he had an accident in the brewery. We don't know what happened, whether he fell over a wooden barrel or whether the brewery horses stepped on his toes or maybe he drank too much. But after that, he was limping. So when you look on the beer coaster on the label on the bottom right, you have that red insignia, and inside you see this little person with a beer mug and a stick, and the one leg is a little bit lifted. So according to legend, he was limping and dangling his arms, weavering his arms in order to keep the balance when he was walking. And apparently he was also a very strict person. So there were a lot of rules to be followed in his tavern, like women were not allowed to drink. It was a men's thing, and 1900s, different time. So the regulars gave him this fun name, the nickname, the Schlenkerla, the little dangling person, which was basically just a way to cope with his strong rules or maybe a little bit stiff manner in the tavern. So the Schlenkerla is the person who walks in that funny way. So when they went out, they said, let's go to Schlenkerla, meaning the person. But over time, that became synonymous with the tavern and eventually with the beer. And today, of course, the name is programmed because when you follow the old proverb, you have 3 pints in order to acquire the flavor, you might schlenker, dangle a bit. So it couldn't be thought better by any marketing company these days. So we really by accident got into that. And again, it was Michael's farsightedness to recognize that this nickname is something you can build a story on, to build a brand on. And just 2 or 3 years ago, I rediscovered that he had registered the name as a brand name in 1922. And in World War II, the registration got canceled or not renewed, with all the horrible things that happened then. And my grandfather then restarted that in the 1950s at a much later time. But in the 1920s, this document, it's just amazing when I found it. It's really cool. It doesn't have legal validation these days, but it shows how great Michael was and how thorough he was in what he was doing. I think without him, Schlenkerla wouldn't be what it is today. Not even close. It takes guts to take the fun nickname of your father to It definitely. I wouldn't dare. Not while he's still around, anyhow.
Get in touch with us on Twitter and Instagram at Daftaboutcraft1.